Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Y'all know this is my favorite part of my job, interrupting great networking that's going on. That's what we're here for, right? Hello, everyone. I'm Cynthia Schneider, CEO at the top of Virginia Regional Chamber, and I welcome you to this PolicyMakers series. It's our annual post-legislative briefing. One of the guiding principles of my life is found in the Bible in the book of Jeremiah in the chapter 29, and it reads, "Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you will prosper too." And given the events of yesterday and the need of our nation for prayer and peace, I would ask that you would join me in a moment of silent prayer for our nation as it mourns again senseless acts of violence, and that we ask for guidance as leaders in this community and give thanks for the peace and prosperity that we so long for. Hallelujah and amen. Today we gather to discuss legislative affairs. You know, the purpose of legislation is to regulate. It is to authorize and provide controls that will hopefully maintain social order and the peace that we desire to live in. So I am so thankful today to have our key legislators for the region at the state level with us. At this time, I'd like to ask Tom Stamulus, who is the chair of the Top of Virginia Regional Chamber Public Policy Committee. He is also the president and CEO of his business, True North Consulting, to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So, good afternoon, everybody. Yes, my name is Tom Stamulus, and I just took over as the chairman for the Public Policy Committee, and just want to share a quick minute about our purpose. What we do is, and I'm just going to read it so I don't screw it up, but our Public Policy Committee provides up-to-date insight on key public policy issues that may impact the Top of Virginia Regional Chamber business community, educating chamber members about key public policy issues, and representing their concerns before local, state, and federal governments and agencies. It is a primary focus of ours. Public policy issues are reviewed and recommendations are presented to the Board of Directors as needed. The committee proactively advocates for the businesses in the Top of Virginia Regional Chamber region. So we also have our legislative priorities that we've worked. I'm not going to get into the details of them because they're all on the table if you'd like to see them. But there's three key areas that we work on. One is transportation and infrastructure, and if you've been on 81, you know why. Workforce solutions, it's always an issue where we're always trying to bring more quality jobs to our area, which of course will then bring a Wegmans for all the people who complain about it. And lastly is government collaboration. And that's kind of a big thing for me because I think there's a lot of individuals that don't get involved because they feel that it might be a little too confusing or they don't know where to get the resources. But I think we've really been working to make our citizens understand, our business owners understand what the legislators have to do and the timelines that they have to do it. So if you have an idea or if you have something that you want to work with, you can now submit it in a reasonable amount of time so that they can work with their staff and get those bills presented for the next session. So really with that, and also the committee is open. We are looking for other individuals. We've had a couple of people that have finished their term and moved on. So if it's something that you're interested in, please get with me here, and I'd be more than happy to invite you. You're more than welcome to come for a meeting. And if you think it's something that you'd be interested in, we'd be more than happy to have you join. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, the Top of Virginia Regional Chamber strives to be the voice for business in the Top of Virginia. We do this by gathering the voice of our diverse membership, and we ask that you add your voice to the conversation at all times. We provide opportunities like this for the community to gather, to convene, to have civic dialogue, to meet with business leaders across sectors, to learn from each other and grow. I want to especially extend our thanks today to Harry Smith and the team at United Bank who sponsors our PolicyMakers series. Thank you, Harry. As many of you know, Harry has a long history of really forming the course for how our community lives today in his involvement in Winchester City Council back in the 1980s. 90s. Yeah, I am. So Harry, thank you so much. Harry really understands the importance of legislative affairs and advocacy and the role it plays for the chamber. Without further ado, I want to also recognize and invite to the panel today Senator Jill Vogel. And while Jill makes her way up, I also want to draw to your attention, hot off the press, the new Voice for Business business directory that just came in yesterday. You'll notice kind of an airport theme. The region takes off. And we want to give a special thanks to Jill for the hard work that she did to help bring the financial funds needed from the state to make this, the money girl, to make this a reality and the incredible economic driver that the development that's taking place at the airport will bring us. So thank you, Jill. There are about 4 of these on each table, but there's plenty more in the hallway as you lead. All of you that are chamber members, your business should be receiving one in the mail as well. And next, our dear delegate, Wendy Goditis. Delegate Dave LaRock. And unfortunately, Delegate Bill Wiley was called out of town on business, and he was not able to join us today, but he did take the time to address some of the questions that had been submitted, and we'll be reviewing those with you. This is an important thing to note about our representatives. You know, in the state of Virginia, it's very unique. Our representatives work full-time jobs. They live and are often raising families right in the districts they represent while serving us amidst that. That is not the case in all other states, and so I would like you to join me in a round of applause and thanksgiving to these representatives who have done such a great job for us in Richmond again this year. And without further ado, I'd like to bring to the podium the man that really knows public affairs well. Christopher West is with the Jackson West Consulting Group. Christopher is a public affairs consultant and legislative advocate. He is such a help to me in helping navigate and understand legislative affairs. He's a part of the Chamber Public Policy Committee. He is a Hanley High School graduate who has, I hear, has had campaign posters in his garage since he was, what, 12? Is that what they say? Yeah, probably, at least. So
I didn't have Harry's, though. Yep, sorry.
So Christopher is going to...
your time, Harry.
Yeah.
That's why.
So I'm going to turn the mic over to Christopher, and he's going to facilitate today for us.
Thank you, ma'am. And how about a round of applause for Cynthia and all that she does here, here at the Chamber. Great leadership under her. And she's correct. Growing up as a kid, I used to have all the city council posters up in all the yard signs. I'd go out and collect them from the county. Used to have Shep Campbell had the Campbell soup can, if you guys remember that, you know, stuff. So yeah, I've been kind of interested in this stuff since I was a kid. So appreciate you all having me back. This is, I think, the 4th time now that I've done this event. And you know, today actually my goal is going to dive a little bit deeper than maybe we have in some of the past events. So we'll see if we can get to it today. Again, a little bit more in-depth conversation. I'm also going to break up the Q&A too. Typically we just wait to the end and do all the Q&A, but I'm going to stop maybe in some of these larger topics just to see if anyone in the audience has a specific question why the legislators here are talking about a specific issue. With that, let me give a couple of minutes to each of these fine folks here to introduce themselves. As Cynthia mentioned, Bill Wiley could not be here today. I did send Bill some questions, and he did send back some answers, so I'll take a second or two today to read a couple of his answers to a few of those questions. Bill sits on the Public Safety Committee, the Transportation Committee, the Finance Committee. He, this past session, filed 14 bills. 6 of those bills passed. and 8 of those were defeated, either in committee or on the floor. Let's see. First up here, let me go to Delegate Dave LaRock. Delegate LaRock is Vice Chairman of the Transportation Committee. He's also on the Education Committee, the Counties, Cities, and Towns Committee. He filed 15 bills this past session, none of which, however, made it through committee or on the floor. But Delegate LaRock, would you like to give just a brief introduction? Do they have mics? Yes. They do. Okay. Can everyone hear in the back or no? Yes? Okay.
Yeah, I've had the distinct honor of serving the 33rd House District, which as of January won't exist anymore. Everything has been redrawn. And that was Western Loudoun, portion of Clark, and portion of Frederick County. I hope to continue serving, and perhaps if there's time toward the end, I'll give you the full campaign. Since that's not what you came here for, you mentioned the committees. I consider myself a conservative Republican. I've run as a Republican each time, and so look forward to learning about the priorities of the people in this room. Chris has already identified 381 with a very logical connection to business and industry, as well as just the residential individuals that use that to travel up and down the beautiful Shenandoah Valley. And that's probably enough.
I think that works. You know, I saw you carrying up 2 glasses of water, and I was like, oh, God, this man's coming to work today. But I saw you give one of those to Senator Vogel, so good. Thank you for being a gentleman. Next up, Delegate Wendy Goditis. Delegate Goditis sat on the Commerce and Energy Committee, Counties, Cities, and Towns Committee, Agriculture, Chesapeake, and Natural Resources Committee. She filed 4 bills this past session, none of which passed. A little bit tougher when you're in the minority. Delegate Goditis, would you like to give us a quick introduction?
Thank you. Very happy to. I'm Wendy Goditis. I represent the current House District 10, which, as Delegate LaRock said, will not be in existence anymore after December or November. It is my great pleasure to be here. I'm so happy to see so many familiar faces. Thank you very much, those of you who came to Richmond and told me what was going to matter to you. Always happy to try to support constituents and close by non-constituents. So the Democrats are in the minority this year. Of the bills that I filed, the one that I was fondest of was the request to create a commission to study the effects of social media on encouraging specific acts of violence. It didn't just say, bullying or mean words. It said murder, suicide, rape, sexual assault, and sedition. And I just wanted a commission. I worked with experts all over the country to craft this legislation. It was groundbreaking in the sense that people in universities all over the place are trying to figure out how to study this, and I would like to be part of that. But that failed with one comment being, it's too big. So that's not the way I was raised. I was raised to think the bigger the problem, the harder you work. Anyway, so that was my favorite of the bill this session. I do just want to say, as we were going through session, I was thinking, oh, this is a hard session because the Senate has this majority, but the House has this majority, and so they're opposite sides of the aisle, and it's tough to get things through. On the other hand, I'm wondering if that, in retrospect, isn't a good thing for the balance. If there's less agreement, then things didn't pass, and so my side might not make me popular for saying that, but it's really interesting, something to think about as we go forward.
Thank you, ma'am. Next up, Senator Jill Vogel. Senator Vogel sits on the Finance, General Laws and Technology Committee, Privileges and Elections Committee, and Rules Committee. She filed 16 bills this past session, 8 of which passed and 8 were defeated, a nice even 500 batting average. Senator Vogel?
Okay. I'm so honored to be here with all of you, and I would just mention, it was super nice that you all went to the airport, but I would say to the people in this room, the men and women in this room, so much of what I'm able to accomplish, I'm only able to accomplish because you guys do a lot of that work to help. You work in the off year, and you work with me, and the airport is a perfect example, and something that you all should be so proud of. And so I'm always so excited when you can deliver for this part of Virginia and for this region, which is now and can continue to be a huge economic engine for a big part of the Commonwealth. And I'm really proud of this region and what we produce and how much business we can continue to attract. And it's in large part thanks to what you all do. So I just wanted to mention that. I had a great session. I enjoyed the bills that I was working hard to push through. Some of that will come up later, and I don't want to bore you with all the details, but it was a great session, and it was particularly bittersweet because it was my last legislative session of 16 years, the end of my 4th term, and I will continue to be the state senator all the way until January. So I encourage you to work me to death because there's still a lot of work left in me. I have loved every minute of this job, and like to everything there is a season, and I think it's super important to know when it's time to move on and move on before someone actually asks you to move on and before it's your time. And so my hope is that I'll still stay super engaged and will always be a part representing this community. And for this to touch on, in case it doesn't come up, but there will be dramatic turnover in the legislature in the next year. It is a shocking number of people in the Senate who are retiring. A shocking amount of change due just to redistricting. So this district will be completely withdrawn. It has been withdrawn. And so a big chunk of my district is now gone. So anyway, with that, I would just say thank you. It's been such an honor to serve you and to have this job. And I'm excited to answer questions and talk about what you all want to talk about.
Thank you, Senator Vogel. You will be missed. So as I mentioned, at today's meeting, I'm going to ask you each a lot more about some specific pieces of legislation that you yourself, your party, the committees that you sat on, or your chamber as a whole voted on this past session. While each question I ask may come from a different angle, I think our audience will be interested in better understanding a few things. If it is a bill that you patroned, why did you patron it? Were you asked to carry it by another person, business, or group? Was it something that you yourself were passionate about? Why did it pass? Why did it fail? Not simply, because it didn't get the votes, but more in-depth analysis of why it was successful or where the bill might have been flawed. I asked everyone in the chamber and a couple other groups here in town to send me questions for today. By far, the largest response that I got back, the most consistent response that I got back were questions regarding Interstate 81. So I'll give each of you an opportunity to talk about Interstate 81. But let me sort of set the stage here. I asked the same question to Delegate Wiley, and he sent me this answer. So I will quickly read his answer. I think it's rather detailed, but again, I'd love for you all to sort of build off this particular answer. So I asked him, is there 100% exclusively dedicated funding for Interstate 81? And I said, if yes, where is it? How much money is it? If no, why not? How do we expect any improvements to ever get funded? And his response was this. Yes, there is funding in place to address much-needed areas for safety, reliability, and efficiency. The projects for the Northern Shenandoah Valley Regional Commission, Stanton District, will not start until 2026. For example, there will be a third lane being added from exit 310 through the city of Winchester and possibly extending up to exit 221. There will also be improvements to decel and XL lanes at each exit. Both the fuel tax dedicated to I-81 and the share of the Interstate Operations and Enhancement Program dedicated to I-81 can only be used to support the I-81 program. However, this funding will never address having a third lane continuous throughout the Commonwealth, or at least through our lifetime, much less our children's lifetime. We are currently looking at a private-public partnership feasibility study to see if that will address possibly adding an optional toll lane only for vehicles and not for trucks. Delegate LaRocque, you are vice chairman of the Transportation Committee. Can you give us any additional insight, building off of Delegate Wiley's response here to this question?
Well, that's really only a token position. It doesn't mean I really know anything about transportation. It is complicated, but it is distinctly underway, and I'm glad to be able to say that. So I put on each of the tables a little bit of a summary of the turnoff from the Office of the Secretary of Transportation. But first and foremost, the simple answer is yes, there is dedicated funding. There are other sources other than the fuel tax that you know you probably heard about. There's bond proceeds, there's TIFIA funding, which is kind of hit or miss, but that's federal funding and a couple other things. So the brief sequence of how we got to where we are today is we formed a commission in the government, and we want to actually do a study first and identify the needs, set some priorities, form a commission who would then identify and sort of set the priorities and the spending and make recommendations to the CPB, who actually then makes the decisions. So that's underway. In 2019, that was a bill carried by Senator Overton and Delegate Fernandez. It was amended by the governor to actually establish a revenue stream, the largest of which is the regional gas tax. There's also a statewide use fee put on trucks, and about 43% of that comes back to this region for the 81 projects, which that's proportional to the amount of truck use in Virginia, which illustrates just how heavily Route 81 is used by trucks. So I think the total that has been put together so far, and at least I'm able to compare the track along with me. I believe a really good PowerPoint present, so that we've taken up several slides, so I just want to touch on the high points. The current funding balance as of July 31st, 2022 is $290.4 million. The progress so far, it doesn't stack up to big projects like the intersections and lanes. It takes time to plan and prepare for right-of-way acquisition and design. But there has been ongoing improvements. The list is basically curb improvements that have been completed. Safety, service, control, enhancements, little things that can make a big difference. Basically, including the towing, which means quicker and more efficient to move disabled vehicles. Traffic cameras have been installed, visual message signs have been installed, and ongoing material signal improvements. So these are kind of the low-hanging fruit, and again, they're underway. And the differences won't be as noticeable. Hopefully, you never notice the traffic jam that never occurs if you don't do it. The backup that never happens. And I think that will really be what we can expect over the next 10 years. There'll be some inconvenience if the project planning is completed and the construction is completed. We'll soon forget about the problems that occurred there, and the progress will lead to a much, much improved corridor. But it does take time. Coming up with money for any project on the scale that is required for these projects is not easy. If you made the appropriations chair, I would probably be like the Secretary of Transportation and disregard all the funding streams and mechanisms that are in place, and I fix 81 like she did, Route 64 coming out there during the years. But that's just really not how it works for the most part. There is a need on I-64. I told one of the secretaries that, and I think the appropriations chair goes out in that direction as well. With this same thing with a need for an efficient emergency evacuation. But
I think that's enough, yeah. Past enough, maybe a mile back. Yeah. Senator Vogel, anything to add? I mean,
I know you're going to be happy for me to say I do not have a lot to add. I mean, I can get by with saying what they said. Both of the folks previously who commented on 81 were accurate. I would just say, to be very specific about the question, yes, there is a dedicated fund, the I-81 Corridor Improvement Fund, as you know. And there's bond authorization for $1 billion. And then to be more specific about what the cost is, right now for everything in the queue going through 2033, the cost is $2.7 billion. And I think the focus, as Dave mentioned, is a lot on the projects in the South. I would just say that when it comes to the hierarchy of priorities of transportation in the Commonwealth of Virginia, I can think of no corridor in greater need than I-81. You ask anybody who travels anywhere in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and yes, the 95 corridor is sometimes backed up. And yes, we've seen 66 struggle, but we've seen massive improvements. 81 has been overlooked for such a long time that the decades that have, the successive decades have just piled up, and what you see is so much truck traffic and so much of a backup every single day on 81 that unless the Commonwealth of Virginia really buckles down and commits to make this a priority, it will soon be such a bottleneck that it's going to have a huge impact on the whole East Coast because we are such a critical north-south corridor. So I hope that we will continue to press forward. I will add also that the Senate budget right now that we are still negotiating has $250 million from the general fund, and we want to fight to keep that money. So that's all.
can one of you answer, is there coordination between the federal government? Obviously, Ben Klein controls now the entire 81 corridor. Is there any federal funding that's available to speed up potentially some of these dates that are, as Bill said, not in my lifetime, not in my child's lifetime? Do you all coordinate at the state level with the federal?
Yeah, you want to say that?
Well, as I mentioned, one of the funding streams is TIFIA loans. That's an acronym for, I had to write it down because I tend to want to substitute the F is funding it, but it's actually finance, Transportation Infrastructure Finance Innovation Fund. And I'm confident that Congressman Klein, I want to call him Ben, will be going to bat for us and getting the federal government to pay its fair share. It is kind of a unique project.
What is its fair share? 50%, 25%, 10%?
Well, yeah, actually, I was just kind of to launch into that. It depends on what your mindset is. The federal government put that road in place, and that was a good investment. The success of it is why it's so widely used, and the demand is now sort of exceeding the capacity. But federal government, when they make an obligation or they make a commitment like that, does not necessarily represent an ongoing commitment. So we can make that case to Congressman Klein and keep presenting the need, as the study was a huge part of a piece of the puzzle that actually identified at a very small level, meaning in individual projects where the needs are. But the federal government's responsibility is whatever responsibility they will accept. And I equate it to a smaller project. The fact that you build something and donate it to somebody, which is sort of what the federal government has done, you then have to convince them of the need. As Jill had referenced, the sheer capacity and the effect that it has on trade on a nationwide level is part of the argument. So wish I could give you a simple answer to that, but it's how strongly we advocate through our congressmen to access what funding is available and how strong the economy is to make that funding available.
Very good. Delegate Gudaitis, anything else to add on this topic?
So in 2019 is when it came up in the legislature. It's when we passed that initial legislation to start the work on 81. I was a strong proponent of that, and in fact, I then became the chair of the 81 Commission for a couple of years. And during that time, in answer to the question about federal funding, I worked very closely with our U.S. Senators, Tim Kaine and Mark Warner. They are very interested in this, and they fought hard for this to be in that infrastructure bill in Congress, which didn't get where we hoped it would get. But they're still interested in it and working on it. There are a couple of things still in the budget, in our non-existent as yet budget for Virginia, and we'll see if a couple more things come through. One of them is $500,000 to study the use of public-private partnership to advance the completion of the 81 corridor expansion with Commonwealth transportation funds. We'll see how that goes. One little comment, Christopher had said that the biggest response you got was about 81, and in the eastern part of my district, the biggest response I get is about the toll road. So we're all very much in harmony as to what's important.
You all have mentioned the state budget bill and the negotiations. Senator Vogel, would you like to just sort of give us a general update? Do you see this being completed, being passed in a week, a month, a special session being called?
So, at the conclusion of session, we concluded everything that dealt with legislation except for the budget. And what we needed to do was get the conferees to meet somewhere in the middle on a handful of things where there was a disagreement. We thought that that would happen before the Saturday at the end of session, and it did not. I spoke to one of the conferees 2 weeks ago, and he said that everybody had taken a break. We had a little break down there in communications over some disputes, and so they kind of took a break. I am confident that they will resume those negotiations, and I don't know if they have already. I'm sure there's a lot of back discussions, but the actual sitting down at the table and the sort of formal piece, it will happen. We'll go back in April for the veto session, and I can assure you that so much work went into that process. And it was a year of our committee meeting all over the Commonwealth, hearing from all the stakeholders, and there's so much writing on it, and so many members did so much work to get things accomplished for their own communities. I don't see a scenario where the conferees just walk away and say, you know what, we're going to leave it alone. I'm confident that we'll get there, but it's just a handful of issues where we often disagree. It's often the same thing. But they're not that far apart. So I foresee us ending up passing that budget, and it's actually very reasonable.
Thank you. Let's move on. I would say,
I think you wanted to add something.
go ahead, Delegate Rock.
Yeah, just quickly, I thought I'd add a few numbers. Good summary, but $3 billion surplus funds. How you can put $3 billion in surplus together in the same sentence or phrase is still a bit of a mystery to me. But the conferees had agreed to, in principle, $950 million in tax cuts with significant new spending beyond House levels in education, behavioral health. But the Senate, Democrat caucus dominated. I always want to make that distinction. If I'm saying a little bit disappointed in what the Senate done, I should make sure that and remind that it's controlled by Democrats. Said that they wanted the maximum of tax cuts to be $500 million. So there's a pretty big difference there between what the House was putting forward. So the skinny budget, they nicknamed it, which is kind of interesting. They pared House Bill 1400, which would be about that big, down to about 3 or 4 pages, which kind of sounds good in some respects, unless you're expecting some of the monies that come forward from that. But it did keep the promise to the Department of Education that schools would be fully funded, $100 million for cost overruns on building projects, and $250 million in the Virginia retirement system. So, yeah, we could be in worse condition, but for schools who want to know what they're doing beyond this year, and anybody who has been expecting funding through the state budget, it still leaves things up in the air.
All right, thank you. Another big issue. Oh, go ahead, Delegate Gades.
I just wanted to say that some of the biggest differences, yes, there's a difference between the Senate budget and the House budget, and the House budget is more interested in huge tax cuts. The Senate budget is more interested in using some of that surplus money to care for people, and those are where the differences come in. The skinny budget, in large part, was to cover a deficit that was an error in the governor's administration that didn't calculate educational funds correctly and left huge amounts of money out of the budget so that the schools have a large shortfall. And this is why, is it Fauquier County? No, Spotsylvania County in the news today. They're talking about huge cuts of teachers, on staff because of this shortfall in the budget. It was a mistake, and it's corrected in the skinny budget.
We have a couple superintendents here. Any questions on that particular issue with regard to funding you'd like to ask our panel? No? Smart. All right, moving right along. Another big issue here is, of course, workforce development. Delegate Goditis, through your committee, passed HB 1470, which is an important bill for business owners in that it established the Department of Workforce Development and Advancement. Can you tell us a little bit about this bill? It consolidated, I believe, the Commonwealth's workforce development policies and programs. Can you tell us a little bit about it, the good things about it, how we'll be impacted here regionally?
So workforce development is so important, and our previous governor and this governor are both focused on it, which is a great thing. But the workforce development programs come in many different flavors from many different organizations, and this bill puts it all in one place so that it can be better kept track of and better run. When it first came to my committee, I was a little hesitant about it because labor seemed to have been left off of the people talking about it. And the labor groups have such wonderful apprenticeships in electricians and carpentry, construction, welding, all those sorts of things. And I wanted to make absolutely sure that labor was at the table and thought this was a good idea. Very quickly it became clear labor was invited to take part and agreed with it all. And so this is one of those rare things where everybody's happy and we can go forward and have better control and management and growth of workforce development in Virginia. It's a great thing.
Very good. Now, a bill, Senator Vogel, that I know a lot of people in this room were following this past session would have increased the penalty for a third or subsequent offense of solicitation of prostitution from an adult, from a Class 1 misdemeanor to a Class 6 felony. Now, this bill died in the Senate Judiciary Committee on an 8-6 party line vote, with all Democrats voting for this bill, while all Republicans voted against this bill. Can you give us a little inside scoop? How did this bill come about, and does that breakdown say anything about these two parties?
I think you hit it right. I think the Republicans voted for it, Democrats voted against it.
I believe it was Democrats voted for it and Republicans voted against it.
With the motion before the.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Sorry, okay. Yeah, he's got that.
Yep.
The bottom line was, it came to me, I'm trying to remember who requested the bill. But the goal was that it was part of the Attorney General and the governor's package on human trafficking. And as many of you know, we have a huge issue with human trafficking, and it's unique to the community that I represent because of I-81. And we believe that the research shows that the issue of prostitution is a big component of the human trafficking piece of this, because so many people are part of that prostitution process, and they are the front people for the people who continue to make the money, and they are often not free to leave. It's a really difficult situation, and the more that I am educated about this, the more shocked I am by how pervasive this problem is. So that was the genesis. Sorry, it took me a second to remember. That was the genesis of this legislation. I understand why some people were philosophically not in favor of a tougher penalty for prostitution, but I found it really compelling, and it was part of a larger package of legislation that dealt with human trafficking that I had introduced. And my concern is that if we don't really take this head on, another bill that I introduced was it required some, as you're coming into a college campus as a college freshman, as part of that orientation, a conversation, a mention about human trafficking, because college campuses have become ripe with this in recent years. And we would all be shocked. I am shocked the more that I learn about it, and how much I appreciate that this is such an epidemic unique to where the community I represent. So with a larger package, some succeeded, some didn't, but I think we make some headway, and really just, it's an issue of education. I'm always surprised when I go to an airport, in the ladies' room, and it says, are you being held against your will? Is someone, are you not free to leave? It's that level that clearly our communities are appreciating. It's enough of a problem that it's now posted in places where, women frequent. So anyway, that was the issue.
1470? Oh, no, I'm sorry.
He read it backwards. The
Yeah.
Democrats did not support it. Republicans,
HB 137.
yeah,
There you go.
Republicans did. The vote was the opposite, resistant.
Delegate LaRock, can you give us an update on efforts this past session regarding executive orders from the governor versus the legislative process? Small business owners from both sides of the political aisle tend to agree here post-COVID pandemic that the current nor any future governor should have the power to bypass the legislative process through executive orders. Did anything change this past session?
Not that I know of. As you know, the year before, the session before, there was a 45-day limit put on the duration of an executive order, maybe some provision for extension beyond that. And that's progress. But what we saw in the Northam handling of the pandemic, I thought, and I hope some in this room at least would agree, that it was just completely out of line. You know, if you look at it, and this took me a little while to kind of get my arms around it, but what you're doing is pausing constitutionally protected rights. Very simple. There are situations where that's in order, and believe me, it's a short list of very extreme situations. That's why executive orders exist. But Governor Northam, you know, basically just ignored any proper boundaries, operating in connection with the Commissioner of Health, who arguably became the most powerful individual in the Commonwealth, and his ability to close things and cancel things. He was supposed to be operating with the Board of Health, and I don't think they ever met and even remotely took the whole pandemic seriously, because the commissioner, acting in their absence, would issue these blanket orders. So I won't go too far into the weeds, but by far we have introduced the most comprehensive, I think, appropriate bill that would put limits on executive orders. I think the number we chose randomly was 10 or 15 days. That fluctuates a little bit. But if you look at court precedent, there has to be three things necessary to limit a constitutional right. It has to be necessary. I think it's very disputable whether any of these executive orders were necessary, proven by the fact that they accomplished very little. Places that were put on lockdown had the same rates of infection as those who were left wide open. So was it necessary is an open question. They would have, if this bill passed, they would have to be no alternatives, meaning, you know, if there was concerns about spread, there would have to be a study and a scientifically legitimate approach taken to examining alternatives. And thirdly, anything that would pass in the form of an executive order would have to be very narrowly tailored, so that only those alternatives that were necessary would be put into place. So, you know, liquor stores stayed open, churches were closed. I mean, just a ridiculous contrast that only proved, I think, that the intervention on the scale that we saw was very much unnecessary. So the idea is there'll be emergencies in the future, but they should be handled in a way that involves the legislature. We're the people that are accountable to you, and if there's going to be something drastic done as needed to be done, the legislature should be reconvened, and the options should be discussed. There should be a very analytical approach based on the scientific input from the scientific community, how other disasters have been managed. And I'll close by saying the one thing that stuck with me when Governor Northam was questioned by the media as to how he arrived at a 10 o'clock curfew on the time when he was announcing it, and he said something like, well, my grandma said that nothing good ever happens after 10 o'clock. And that was the whole answer. That was the whole answer. So I thought it was kind of comical. It really accurately depicted how he approached doing things. It was on intuition. People like to think his medical experience would inform him. I don't think that was the case. So we'd like to pass this eventually.
Delegate Gudaitis, you are on the Agriculture, Chesapeake, and Natural Resources Committee, and we're co-patron of House Bill 1660, the Dairy Producer Margin Coverage Premium Assistance Program. Can you tell us more about this bill and what it did?
Well, it doesn't sound like a lot to most people, but it's a wonderful, almost literally life-saving measure margins of milk prices drop so suddenly, and you have the milk, and you can't tell your cows don't produce until the price comes up, and so, you know, they have to throw away their milk sometimes, they can't make a living. So this was a bill that, my bill that passed in, I don't know, 2020 maybe, and this year's bill was just a continuation of it, and it covers that margin. It makes the dairy farmer whole when the prices don't allow him to survive, or her. There we have wonderful female dairy farmers as well. And it also requires them to have a management program for their farm, an environmental management program. So we benefit the environment while we save our dairy farmers. It's a really wonderful thing.
Thank you. Senator Vogel, SB 1464, the Virginia Power Innovation Fund and Program. Can you tell us about the benefits of this legislation and what it might mean for Virginia's future?
I'm excited to say the actual governor just signed it this week in Southwest Virginia in a big bill signing ceremony. And the issue that Virginia has is one of competition and remaining competitive. And the states around us are allocating resources for energy innovation, for grant funds for research and for development into new and emerging technologies. And because Virginia didn't have language, and we didn't have language in our budget, and we didn't have a funding mechanism, we are also not only not competitive with states around us for some of those jobs and some of those industries, but we're also not able to draw down federal dollars. That is super important to me. We should not be ever in a position where we're leaving money on the table for businesses in Virginia or for research or development. So what this bill does is it sets aside a fund allocated just to this, the Energy Innovation Fund. My bill also funded it to the tune of $10 million. That remains to be seen whether or not that money will actually be in the budget when they go back and pass that budget. The very controversial part of it was not all the renewables and some of the energy innovation and the research and development. The controversial part was the nuclear piece, the sort of micronuclear part of this that so many people are so interested in Virginia exploring and developing, and particularly in Southwest Virginia and in the parts of Virginia that are economically depressed. They're very eager for this. Other states are doing it, and so there is a separate fund for that piece of it that's $5 million out of $10 million, which is the Nuclear Innovation Hub. And that was actually the part of the legislation that ginned up the most interest and actually the most support. And the piece of that that's controversial is there are some people who just 100% will not support the nuclear piece ever for Virginia, and I understand that, but we cannot be left behind in these emerging markets. It's super, super important for Virginia. So I'm happy to say that it passed, and in the end it passed unanimously out of the Senate, and it is hopefully going to be funded. But the key piece is we have the language and we have the fund so that we were able to draw down those federal dollars.
Very good. Delegate LaRocque, HB 1461, it says passed the House on a party line, failed in a Senate committee. This was Department of Education to establish a uniform system of discipline for disruptive behavior. Why was this necessary? What problem did this solve? And will this help support teachers in their classrooms? And finally, do you think this is attributing to the loss of seasoned teachers leaving the profession?
So I get Delegate Wiley's question in his absence. This was his bill, that's why I say that. Well, if you have to start with, do we need better discipline in the classroom, then you're apparently not paying much attention to that. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but if you had heard the testimony that we heard in education in support of this bill, it's rather striking. So the need clearly is there. Teachers are being threatened and injured. And it's interesting when you talk to teachers who've been around for a while. This is something new. We can, like a lot of things, I guess we'll attribute it partly to COVID. Kids were, thank you to the former Governor Northam, were cooped up for a long time at home, staring at computers. I think that really destabilize them, maybe for lack of a more proper word there. But I think there's just a number of things, and it's hard to encapsulate it in a simple answer, but the kids are just not behaving, and teachers need the tools and the authorization to deal with them or to have them removed from the classroom. And otherwise, the kids who are well behaved, which is most of the kids, can't get a proper education. So I'm just kind of restating the need. I'm sure I supported the bill. I think it came through our committee, but it really is an indicator more of a social problem. I did put forth a fatherhood initiative, and I think that clearly the absence of families, a father and a mother, a traditional family raising kids and inculcating values, imparting them to these kids is part of what is, it's just not working as it should. So that, again, not a concise answer, but we have to look at, I think, the whole problem and reinforce the development of these kids so that when they come to school, they aren't venting pent-up frustrations and anger and directing them at teachers. And yes, again, it's very obvious, again, from talking to teachers, and just common sense would tell you that if they can't protect themselves, I mean, from the threats and sometimes physical abuse, that it's certainly going to make teaching a less attractive career. Perhaps our superintendents might articulate that. I think that there should be surveys actually asking teachers why they're leaving the profession, or maybe even others that might be on that career path. What is it that they would like to see done differently so that we can draw more people into that profession? And if I may, can I answer a little bit of Jill's last question, or am I over my budget on time?
I think you're almost always over your budget, but feel
I'll
free.
take that as a yes.
Yeah, feel free to add a remark to Senator Vogel.
When-
Yeah.
Seize the remaining of my time on that question from
Well-
my colleague on my left.
Hey, thank you.
You're welcome.
What came to mind is I'm not indulging myself without at least the illusion, thinking that this is relevant to this community. When I heard Congressman Klein speak, probably in this room, no, it might have been one of his town halls. He said the biggest problem we face, and I agree with him completely, is energy policy. So when you're talking about business development in whatever part of the state, if you can't deal with things like this RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which basically just is a big money transfer, purports to reduce carbon dioxide. We've actually, since it's been initiated for two years ago, huge increase in carbon dioxide. Basically, all it's done is require the companies that sell us our electricity to go out of state. So again, it's just a big shell game. I think there's some people in this room who've helped educate me on things like the fact that carbon dioxide is basically plant food, but we're paying an awful lot of money to come up with solutions to the problems that don't exist. What do we call it in the legislature? A cure in search of a cure in.
Solution in search of a problem.
There we go. That's it. Thanks, Joe. I yield the rest of my time back to whoever wants to.
Well, this is good. Good transition back to Senator Vogel. Senator Vogel, can you tell us about SB 1370, which is your underground utility line for electric vehicles that passed this session, and also talk about the effort to untangle Virginia from California's sort of EV sales standard, which was also updated this year.
Just to clarify, what he was talking about were the EV sales standards, which is really critical in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and that is the emission standards for vehicles. He was talking about that, and that was connected to what I talked about, which was energy policy in Virginia. My bill was different than that entirely and had to do with new and emerging technologies not related to vehicles, and a fund there on, new and renewables and nuclear. The notion that energy plays such a big role in the Commonwealth of Virginia is something not to overlook, and it is also a subject sometimes of great distress for people in the community that I represent. And in the case of the question you just asked me, the bill that you read and you referenced was underground transmission, and you said for electric vehicles. It's not electric vehicles. It's underground transmission just for transmission, and the genesis of this was a request from Fauquier County. The Fauquier County Board of Supervisors, like all of the counties that I represent, They come to me with a legislative agenda, and I think most of you know that. Our school boards do, our superintendents do, our local sheriffs do, our board of supervisors do, our county executives do. And they come with a list of hierarchy, or a list of their priorities and a hierarchy of need. And one of the biggest issues that was facing Fauquier County was data centers, one in particular. And I know that it doesn't quite impact this community the same way, but in that part of my district, it became the single biggest issue. That was, one, the location of the data center, two, the fact that the locality had approved it, frankly, with the understanding that it's going to be a tremendous benefit to the tax base, because so much of development had been stopped, and you can't survive without some tax base. So Amazon was coming in, and then the side effect of a new data center is it requires one new substation. And substations require connectivity, and that requires power lines. The community is always concerned about power lines for two reasons. One, for energy reliability, because that means that it's just more likely that in the case of a storm or something, your lines are down, you have connectivity issues, it just creates issues in those urban areas. And two, people are always very, very concerned if it goes through a residential area, people are very upset about what it might do to their property value. And so the Board of Supervisors passed a resolution. I mean, it's one thing to put it on your list and say, hey, Senator Vogel, please pass this bill or do something, but they did that, and then they adopted a resolution urging the members of the legislature, me specifically, to do something. And so the do something as a legislator is always your big challenge. Like, what the heck am I possibly going to do? I'm not going to go shut down Amazon. I'm not going to stop a data center that somebody's brought in. There's a great amount of disagreement about the economic development. That's not my call. That's a locality's decision. But what the one thing I could do, and this was meaningful and impactful, was to say, to the extent that the power line itself is disruptive, to the extent that this goes through a residential area, and to the extent that I can add it as part of a pilot project that currently allows for the undergrounding of transmission lines, I will seek the legislature's permission to do that with this line. And that's exactly what Fauquier County hoped I would do. It's exactly what I did do. And fortunately, the legislature passed it and allowed me to do it. It's a very limited area. It says it has to be taken to the State Corporation Commission, the application has to be less than $40 million in added expense. And so it's very, very narrowly drawn and narrowly tailored to limit the expense, but to also generate a lot of improvement and get a lot of bang for your buck so that you don't have the overhead lines doing to the community and the landowners what they are super, super upset about. So that is the genesis of that. I happen to be a big fan of undergrounding power lines because we all know, one, it just from the impact on the view shed, it looks a lot nicer, but two, in the time when you have big snowstorms, if you're doing constituent service, you are never allowed to hang up your phone because there is always a family, a crisis, a person, in a hotel or something where because they can't get to the lines fast enough and make those repairs, everybody's wiped out. And it has a really big impact on, local businesses. So that's the genesis of that bill. And I apologize for the very long-winded explanation. They always say never fall in love with your own bill. Well, you can tell I kind of fell in love with my own bill.
Very good, thank you. Each of you certainly has been impacted by redistricting, so I would love to hear from each of you your perspective on what sort of the future holds for the House, for the Senate, all the retirements, of course. The House might change, 50%, the Senate might change by a third. Just sort of your outlook for those, understanding that there's a likelihood none of you might be back next year. So it's kind of an interesting perspective, potentially, we'll see. On, again, the changes that you sort of foresee in both chambers here going forward. What do you think the key issues are going to be in the upcoming elections, et cetera?
As with Senator Vogel, I enjoyed my last general session. This winter, I'm not running again. I will say that I really like the way my particular district was redrawn. The districts are supposed to follow 3 rules. One is compactness. They're supposed to be compact. They're supposed to keep community of interest together, and they're supposed to use natural boundaries like mountains or rivers. Well, the new district very much does that. Now, it's not necessarily a district that would vote for me, The district deserves a representative that it wants, and I'm fine with that. I feel like I've done my bit, 6, 7 years, and I'm ready to get back to real life. But it is an incredible honor, absolutely amazing. As Senator Vogel said, there's going to be huge turnover. There were retirements, there are lots of primaries between incumbents, and there's just going to be a huge turnover. Now, I find that a little bit terrifying for Virginia because, yes, we are losing a lot of institutional knowledge. I've been there for 3 terms, and I still feel like a new kid. So when people say term limits, yes, I'm okay with term limits around, 30 years or whatever, 20 years, I don't know. But I know that the institutional knowledge that we are losing is a little bit scary, and people are going to be scrambling to learn the intricacies, especially of things like the budget. So redistricting was necessary for lots of reasons. I think my take is that I like the philosophies of the new districts, but people are going to have to understand that the legislature will be pretty green for the next few years.
Thank you. Senator Vogel?
Redistricting is always disruptive. It happens after the census every 10 years. You have to redraw all the district boundaries to be consistent with population so that there's a fair distribution of population for every elected representative. The problem is, how do you do that? And that's always a challenge. And it's often challenged, it's litigated, there are disagreements between parties. Where we ended, I think, is reasonable, but it yielded dramatic changes in districts around the Commonwealth of Virginia for lots of obvious reasons. We've had a lot of population changes, and it was also drawn by a commission. So there was a lot in the sort of the process that made it a little different. But the outcome is also different because there were so many people in the course of their political service who were nearing the end of a really impressive lifetime of public service. And I think when you are at that point in your life and you're someone like Senator Dick Saslaw, who's from Fairfax, who had been in for 48 years, that's a really long time for starters. But it's also a very daunting task to go introduce yourself to a substantially new group of people. And it was the same for a lot of very senior people in leadership. So to echo her comments, Wendy's comments, it is going to be hugely disruptive. And I know a lot of people, myself included, have always been fans of, it's super important to have new people. It's super important to have new ideas and people to come in and challenge the status quo. But when you tip the scale the other way too much, then you end up with a state that's entirely run by staff. And I work in a lot of states where they have year-round legislatures. They have legislatures with very, very short term limits where people can only serve 2 terms. And what ends up happening is the only people that know how things work, that know how to put a budget together, that understand actually what's allowed and what is not allowed are staff, committee staff, and staff in the legislature. And when that happens, you as voters really lose out because we all end up yielding all of that authority and all that discretion to staff people who sometimes are very mired and set in old ways, and they should not be allowed to have that authority. So that's the one thing I'm concerned about. I have great respect for the staff on our committees, and I have great respect for the staff in the Senate Clerk's office, but I do worry a lot. The institutional knowledge that we're going to lose is just astounding. I don't think anybody appreciates what is going to happen in Virginia. This will be near historic turnover. I think there's probably one time in the 70s when we had numbers like this. I would say half of the Senate out of 40 people will be gone or will be new. And every day a new person announces that they're not running again. And I think a lot of that has to do with it's a whole new district. It's not my community anymore. No one wants to represent a community that's not their own, and that makes a big difference.
Delegate LaRocque?
How much time do I have?
1 minute.
That would be West Coast time, right? Yeah, it brings to mind something I read or heard about the time I came into office, and it was somebody who'd been there for 20-plus years saying, I really thought I knew the ropes when I was here for 10 years, but after 20 years, I realized I really didn't know that much. And that kind of speaks to what has been said, that there's a loss of institutional knowledge. Some turnover is certainly healthy. I'm just thrilled that we're going to keep the majority, and we're going to have Speaker Gilbert in charge, very fair man. And, but I've heard him called a career politician. That's quite absurd to think that you put a lucrative career on hold to make $17,000 a year and spend, almost full time pursuing the interests of the Commonwealth it's not accurate at all. There's a lot to be said for experience. I think that's what I'll be trying to get across to people as I offer to continue to serve. It's knowing who to trust. Jill, can I get an amen to that? Wendy? It's knowing who to trust, where to go to ask questions when you're doing constituent services, whether you're forming a bill, or even the organizations outside the government who have come to specialize in the fields that may be pertinent to what you're doing. And so you've got to have people that know how to negotiate and get things done. And I think this is, we're going to witness a sea change here. And we don't want another couple of years where, the interests of the Commonwealth get run roughshod over. And people who, I don't know, maybe they have just taken an oath of office, don't remember what it really means. That goes on in Richmond, believe it or not. We make laws that are completely unconstitutional. Fortunately, we have a Supreme Court that'll set things straight once in a while, but I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Chris, for not cutting me off.
Thank you. We've got through about half the questions I wanted to ask, but I do want to leave time for Q&A. So does anyone have a question that they would like to ask one of our panelists? Not a soul. Let me wrap up then with one, sort of last question. What can folks hear in this room? If someone has a bill, if someone has a regulation, right, that is impacting their business or maybe their way of life, when does the process start? If you can give them advice, when do they need to get interested? When do they need to start meeting with their legislator, talking about following that bill? Wendy says now. So you want to expand on that, Wendy? And if you can, sort of lay out the process potentially for them, because I know a lot of folks in this room have approached me, about specific bills or specific ways that, again, their business or their organization, their nonprofit is being impacted. How do they get involved? How does the process start? How does it play out throughout the year? Just tips, tricks, anything you've got to offer.
Well, this is what we do year-round, and we are always, I speak for us all, I hope, when I say we're always glad to hear from constituents who have a need or a great idea. And it could be something very simple that you can just come to me and I can say, oh, that's brilliant, and I can go and have it drawn up and file it, well, not file it, but have the bill drawn up in Richmond. Even if I'm not coming back, I can have that bill drawn up, and maybe the person who moves into my seat, I can say, our constituent said that this is a real need, and I can hand that bill off. So it's not that you can't talk to us just because we're not coming back. We're still in the job. That bill can still be drafted. And the process of getting support for it, if it's something more complex, then I and others will spend the year helping find support or opposition, or what are the unintended consequences of that. And over the year, maybe we find a whole bunch of organizations that think, yeah, that is a great idea. And if you file it and it comes before the legislature, we'll come and speak to it and support it, and maybe it'll pass. So and the other thing I tell people is, if you go to your legislator and your legislator says that doesn't fit with my beliefs or what I am trying to do in the legislature, you can go to some other legislator. There's no law that says you can only talk to the person representing you. You can call someone in the next county. It doesn't, there's no limit on that. And if you think it's a super great idea, you can call a whole bunch of them. So always feel free. I don't know a legislator who doesn't want to hear good ideas about legislation, and certainly in terms of needs. So feel free.
My answer is the same. There is no good or bad time. The time is when you have the problem. Call your legislator. Call my office, and sometimes it's legislation, but most of the time it's not. There are lots and lots of solutions to a business problem, a school problem, a community, a transportation, fill in the blank problem. And we have the resources in our office to try to help. And that's the thing that I really enjoy a lot, and that is the ability to work with people in the community and come up with new and creative ways to solve problems. And a lot of things go unsolved, sometimes just through benign neglect. And you find out that you're not the only person that has that problem. So, and when it comes to legislation, sometimes you put it together really quickly. Sometimes if I know I'm not the person, for example, that is going to make the most compelling case, I'll go find somebody in another region of Virginia perhaps and say, I really need you to carry my constituent's bill. I need you to find 5 people in your district whose situation is even worse. It's bloodier and gorier and more horrific, and it'll actually even make more of a case for my person's bill. So, there are all kinds of ways to do it. So when you have problems, I would just encourage you to please call me, call us, and I'm always eager to help. And sometimes it's a bill, and sometimes it's not.
Delegate LaRock?
Yeah, so I'll try to accomplish 2 things, add a little bit to what's already been said, and pitch a bill that should have passed this year. Things can get started different ways. I've seen an accident. What was it what they call when the truck's raised up too high? There's an accident toward the latter part of session, and the need was so apparent that it came forward and the bill passed, and that's just a rare, very rare example. But somebody brought that forward, somebody listened, and it became law. On the opposite end of the spectrum, a friend of mine, Jay March, who's a veteran, strong advocate for Veterans Affairs, he brought forward to several legislators, which is good. He didn't just hand it to one, expanding the partial tax exemption, Virginia state income tax exception to veterans, to not stop at put a cap at 55, to allow any veteran to have that access to that. Now, great justification for it. He did a super job explaining how that would be beneficial to the Commonwealth overall. Well-trained people coming out of the military, seeing Virginia as a place that is tax-friendly to them and staying here instead of going to another state. Well, Jay brought not only a rough draft of the bill, but a well-assembled set of reasons that it should pass. That's really the best way to do it. Not everybody has the time to do that, but if you have something that is really of interest to your community, or something that really needs to be done, if you can present it through a group like the Top of Virginia Regional Chamber, or an advocacy group that has some specialty in that area, it really jumpstarts an idea. If you have to start from scratch, often we'll look to other states, see if it's been done, and learn from that. But if you really are starting from scratch, you don't want to do it a week before crossover, and actually you don't want to do it a couple weeks even before start of session, because that's when legislators are just absolutely slammed. So the more time you can give it, the more thought and preparation you can put into an idea. If you can find that it's being done in other states, then who knows? It might just make it through the sausage factory and be recognizable on the other side.
Anyone come up with a question? If not, thank you again to our panelists and our legislators for coming again. You all will be sorely missed, Delegate Gudaitis and Senator Vogel. Delegate Rock, maybe we'll be back in the fall.
Oh,
We'll see.
perhaps. If I may, just a point of clarification.
Yes, sir.
On the budget, the Democrats want to help people, fair enough. I think the Republicans want to put money back in the pockets of people who paid the taxes. So if you're overcharged, you deserve a refund. And just slight philosophical differences. And I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you need to learn more about how to move legislation through, I want to draw your attention to the Chamber website. Look for the Elevate Your Voice section, and there are templates of how to write a letter, how to make a meeting, what to do after a meeting, all the steps that you need to take to help move towards enacting some legislation, helping the legislators know what you need to hear. It's a really great piece of work done by Julie Schaefer, who was our former Director of Legislative Affairs. So please take a look at that, share the word on that. Thank you all for being here today. We thank you all for being here. There's a little token of our thanks in a little bag before you. There's a different one for Wendy because Jill got it last time, and we're assuming that we're not saying goodbye yet to Delegate LaRock since he's going to stay in the game here. But just a little token of appreciation for all that you have done for us. Thank you so much. We appreciate you. Thank you all for being here. Keep lifting the voice of business in the top of Virginia.